Kia ora koutou. My name's Kate Stone. I actually work as a criminal defence lawyer, but I have a personal interest and have done some work previously on youth engagement with constitutional issues, but also generally legislative and policy change. And I was asked to give or to talk about youth perspectives on the Constitution and the constitutional review. And I suppose the approach I've taken is to try and engage with other youth's perspectives rather than just giving my perspective on what youth might think. So the basis of our discussion was two programs that were run, one which Wayne Matt mentioned this morning, which was the Empower New Zealand workshop, which was held in Wellington in August last year, and that involved 50 pretty highly engaged young people drafting a draft constitution. So that whole workshop was focused on producing a draft single written document which was to be a potential future constitution. The other program was a series of workshops run by Youth Law in Auckland, and that involved around about 350 young people at various different organisations. So some of them were law students or young leaders, but the majority of them were young people who were involved with other sorts of social organisations, largely because they were no longer in mainstream education, so they were in alternative schools or doing some other kind of education. And so I guess a lot of students who wouldn't naturally be inclined to or necessarily have the education around these issues to engage with the Constitution. So quite a diverse range of perspectives, I guess, and I guess there's a lot of value in the diversity, but it's also quite difficult to draw, I guess, generalisations as well from such a diverse group of people. But in fact, despite the demographic differences, there were significant commonalities. But in terms of an overarching difference would be the sense amongst the young people who engaged in the youth law workshops of sort of distrust and of insecurity about their futures, which was not present in the discussions which occurred at the Empower New Zealand conference. And I think what's important about that is I think it brings us back to that question that was posed by several speakers about, well, do we even need to engage in this constitutional reflection now? Is it a moment of crisis? Is there any reason to do it? And I think that that sense of lack of cohesion, a lack of security in particular communities, I think that indicates that it is a time in which we do need to reflect upon our governance arrangements and how the rights of our respective communities are or are not being protected. So in terms of the substantive rights, I guess, that young people were particularly concerned about, there was a really strong emphasis on the need to include social and economic rights in any kind of constitutional arrangements, and a lot of surprise that in fact these rights aren't currently incorporated into the Bill of Rights. So the right to education, most of the well, in fact, all of the young people who were involved in Empower NZ had a pretty good understanding about what our current constitutional arrangements were, but they, in their draft constitution, they incorporated social and economic rights. The young people who engaged in the youth law workshops were surprised that education, access to education, access to healthcare, access to housing, all of those kinds of things weren't actually incorporated into our Bill of Rights, and saw those as absolutely fundamental things which should be incorporated. One of the interesting things which they brought up were issues around the availability of alcohol, control of drugs, and controls around cigarettes and smoking, and controls around junk food and healthy food. So even amongst a group which I guess would probably be classed as relatively disengaged, the issue about GST on fruit and vegetable came up several times. And I think what I've kind of said is one of my tasks in this is to try and not let the medium of these young people's expression, I guess, get in the way of the message, because I think some of what they've said a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider to be relevant to this constitutional conversation. And I think actually, I guess what I'm hoping to be able to do is pull out of what they've said some concrete recommendations about ways in which we could incorporate these views into a constitutional arrangement. So, for example, in terms of GST on fruit and vegetables and controls on junk food and controls on the availability of alcohol, I think one of the issues that raises is about transparency around policy making and who's involved in lobbying government. And I was interested in your handout that in the Constitution of Santa Monica they have a provision which relates to the fact that corporate entities, their directors and managers do not enjoy special privileges and powers under the law that subordinate communities' rights to their private interests. So I think there's an argument to be had about, the transparency around who is involved in making law and policy and the respective power imbalances there. It was almost a given. There was not really anyone who, amongst these young perspectives, who came out and said that the Treaty of Waitangi wasn't relevant. I think that was a given amongst these young people, but there was a strong sense that the current arrangements were unsatisfactory, but also a sense that there wasn't enough education. They didn't feel equipped enough to necessarily say what should happen, but that there definitely needed to be recognition of it. It needed to be better, but they weren't too sure how. In the Empower New Zealand workshop, they made the Treaty of Waitangi a fundamental constitutional document, but didn't give any power to invalidate legislation or policy if it was inconsistent with the treaty. But they did use principles of tikanga, which are contained in the treaty throughout the draft constitution. So I guess in a sense tried to incorporate the ideas of the treaty itself into the draft constitution while allowing the treaty to remain its own autonomous thing outside of essentially a more comprehensive Constitution Act. Environmental protection and sustainability was one that was also fundamental in terms of the Empower New Zealand Constitution, but also the youth law workshops. It was one that was brought up consistently. The need to protect our resources, the need to have more sustainable forms of energy, the need to have better public transport, protect animal rights, protect our parks and reserves, and that was something which should be incorporated into any kind of constitutional arrangement. A couple of youth-specific issues that were raised were there was a lot of mention of the issues of domestic violence and in particular child abuse, and in our session we had some discussion about how UNCROC, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, could be incorporated into our constitution so as to protect young people. And I think there are other mechanisms as well that we could use. So until recently in the family court jurisdiction, there's been the ability to have a lawyer for the child, to give a voice to children as they're going through the family court process. I'm pretty sure that's either already gone or being got rid of in the reforms to the family court, but I think that's an example of a way in which in all kinds of different spheres we could give voices to children and young people who, because of their youth or lack of education or knowledge, aren't able to voice their opinions themselves. The lack of youth representation and voice was raised in a couple of contexts. So the suggestion for youth representation in Parliament and on councils was raised. I know that some councils have youth advisory panels, but I don't know how effective their participation is. And there was an argument made for lowering the voting age. Now that wasn't across the board, but there were some people who thought it should stay the same, some who thought it should be raised, some who thought it should be lowered, but overall more people thought it should be lowered. But the caveat to that was that it should be lowered in conjunction with providing more education around voting, and told us about a system that they have in Norway where schools are able to run mock elections prior to the general election, essentially a complete mock run of the upcoming election with the same candidates, and the people and the young people in the schools get to vote as if they were voting in the election. And I think participatory types of learning like that would be really beneficial if we were to lower the voting age. I guess one of the overwhelming things across the board was even where there wasn't necessarily an explicit statement as to whether people thought the Constitution should be supreme law or entrenched or in a single written document, there was a strong feeling that there needed to be mechanisms for ongoing review of the Constitution, and that review had to be informed by meaningful participation, including the participation of young people. And I think that's something that could be built into the Constitution itself. But obviously would also need to be coupled with this issue that's come up continually, it seems, throughout the 2 days is the need for more civic education of one description or another. I mean, in order to facilitate the meaningful participation of young people in this process, that there needs to be capacity building around that. So we had on that note, we had a bit of discussion about whether or not a single written document constitution deals with this idea of a lack of awareness of what the Constitution is. And I guess the point we got to was that a single written document can be a starting point, but it's not sufficient to raise public awareness about the Constitution. And if we are to have a single written document, it's fundamentally important that the language is accessible to young people, and that the Constitution is surrounded by educational tools as well. So in terms of the resources that I drew on, the youth law workshops, the results of those were a series of video submissions and a series of essentially brainstorms, and those are going to be submitted to the Constitutional Review Panel. And I guess will become publicly available. And the Empower New Zealand draft constitution and report is available online at the McGuinness Institute. So you guys can take a look at those. There's also an article written by Dean Knight of Victoria University, and one of the participants in that workshop, talking about the process they went through and some of the difficulties they had engaging as young people with this process of drafting a constitution. So it's actually quite informative, I think, even just to reflect upon the process that they went through in doing that, and that as an exercise of constitutional learning and engagement. So yeah, thanks.